Chapter 6 of Alexander the Great by Ada Russell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Conquest of Syria and Phoenicia, 333 through 332 B.C. In the late autumn of 333 B.C., the great battle of Issus took place. Darius, the unfortunate Persian monarch whose reign fell in Alexander's day, had at last taken the field in person against the Macedonian invader, and assembled a vast oriental army on a Syrian plain very suitable for arraying such a force. Darius was burning with impatience to meet his enemy, and as Alexander still tarried in Cilicia, he broke up his camp and sought him, believing that he had retreated on news of the approach of such an overwhelming force, led by the sacred majesty of Persia. Thus he entered Cilicia by the Amani gates, at the same time that Alexander was hastening into Syria by the Syrian gates. The Athenian orator Charidemus, now living at the Persian court, was slain for warning Darius of the excellence of the Macedonian army. And evil dreams in vain visited Darius's pillow as he tossed on the magnificent couch in his rich tent. In Asia and in Greece it was believed that Alexander's army could never face the multitudinous host of Asia, led by the great king in person. When Alexander heard that he had passed Darius unawares, he turned and came up with him at Issus, and was hardly able to believe his own good fortune in the chance of the battlefield. The superiority of the Asiatics in numbers was entirely nullified by the nature of the ground, a coast plain only 3 miles broad. The river Pinaris, which flows west into Issus Bay, lay between the two armies, and Alexander proceeded to arrange his lines on the south side of the stream, with the sea to his left and the mountains to the right, as near to the sea as possible, so that the foe who held the mountain heights might not cast down missiles on his army. At the same time he had to guard against the possibility of being outflanked on his right. As it turned out, the Asiatics on the heights fled when a small force that Alexander sent to keep them in check approached, and troops detached by Darius to turn the flank of the Macedonians failed to execute their orders. Alexander made one of the eloquent speeches with which he roused his soldiers' hearts to war. When he closed, the soldiers shouted with one voice that they only wished to be led on. The king then rode slowly forward, restraining their impetuosity so that they might not be out of breath. But when he came to the Pinaris, he let them go. They dashed swiftly across the stream and up to its precipitous sides to meet the foe on the top of the bank. A cavalry fight like that at the Granicus followed. The riders were so closely locked together that even those who wished to do so could not fly. All the time Alexander, both soldier and general, sought to come to Darius, clear to view, seated in his chariot in the center of his army and surrounded by his chief subjects. His valiant brother, Oxythrace, a prominent figure, fought near him, slaying every would-be assailant, and round the royal chariot soon lay a heap of corpses of the most distinguished Persians slain in the defense of Darius. Alexander, in endeavoring to reach him, received a wound in the thigh. At length the Persian monarch, who had shown great personal courage in earlier years, was either seized with panic or thought it right to save himself. He turned to flee away in his chariot, but the country soon proving too rough, he leaped to the ground, cast off the insignia of royalty, leaving even his bow, and rode away on a horse kept for this contingency. The two great kings had come face to face, and the genius of Darius was rebuked under that of Alexander. The greater part of his army followed him in flight, the soldiers throwing away their armor that they might fly the faster. Alexander longed to pursue, since Asia was not his until he had captured Darius, but he was forced to return by a call for help from his own left wing. The Persian right had compelled the Thessalian cavalry on Alexander's left to give ground, even pushing them back across the Pinaris. Before he arrived, however, the Thessalonians had rallied and slain their opponents, daunted by the way the battle had gone on the other side of the field. Alexander then set out in pursuit of the fugitives, But the great king was already far away, and at nightfall he returned. Sparta and Athens at this time were rejoicing over tidings that Alexander was blocked up in Cilicia by the Persians in the last extremity. Meanwhile 100,000 Asiatics. Footnote: we cannot be sure of these numbers, and it seems probable that the accounts exaggerate. Close footnote. Lay dead upon the field or along the line of flight, a ravine being bridged by the pursuers by filling it with corpses, and the air round them was heavy with the scent of death and resounding with the howls of beasts of prey. The Macedonian conquerors were holding their revels in the tents of the vanquished at Alexander's return, and he found that his soldiers had already entered the tents of the enemy, religiously reserving for their king the personal possessions of Darius, including his wife and children. The greater part of the baggage, with most of the women and children, had been bestowed at Damascus, but there were nevertheless much to seize in the luxurious Persian tents. The king found the ground strewn with purple raiment, gold, silver, and precious stones dropped by the pillagers on their way to their own quarters, while the shrieks and sobs from the women's quarters testified to the brutality with which the non-combatants were being treated by the rough soldiery. Alexander arrived hot and dusty from the chase of the Persians, and exclaimed eagerly as he entered the camp that he should wash off the sweat of battle in Darius's own bath. He amused himself with all the toilet accessories of the great king, the basins, ewers, and vials of perfume, all of purest gold, wrought with skill, and with luxuries and appointments new to his simplicity. He examined the bedchamber and feast prepared, and then, instead of flouting it as a Spartan king would have done, he said, "This was a king indeed." A new notion of monarchy was already forming in the mind of the Macedonian chief. He and his intimates, bathed and properly perfumed, were enjoying their magnificent feast, when they became aware of anguished groans in the neighboring tent. Alexander sent the guard, who entered and found the ancient Sisygambis, mother of Darius, and his beautiful wife, Statira, with her children, lamenting the death of Darius. The royal mantle had been found and brought to the harem as a sure token of the great king's death. Alexander, it is said, was moved to tears, and sent Leonatus and some guards to assure the royal family that Darius lived. They received the news of Leonatus's approach in sullen silence, believing that Alexander had sent to murder them in their turn. The messenger was forced to enter unbid, and they threw themselves at his feet to beg, not for life, but that before death they might bury Darius with due rites. Their fears were at once dispelled, and they were treated by Alexander in a way that was highly praised by the ancients. It is even said that his captives became attached to him as to a son and protector, and afterwards, shortly before his death, he married one of the children, Statira. Alexander continued southward along the coast of Phoenicia, sending Parmenio to Damascus to secure the treasure of Darius. At Marathus a letter from Darius arrived, begging for the surrender of his mother and wife and children, and reproaching Alexander for his invasion of Asia. To this letter Alexander replied that the predecessors of Darius had invaded Greece, that Darius had commenced the present war by aiding Alexander's Grecian enemies, and that Darius had bribed his father's assassins. He was a murderer and usurper, but if he came to Alexander in person, and Alexander would send hostages, he should receive whatever he should demand. But in future, concluded the king, address me as king of Asia, and not as your equal. Make your request as of one who is lord of all your lands. If you do not do this, you will be considered as a rebel, or, if you like, we will fight another battle on the subject, and save yourself the trouble of running away, for wherever you go I shall follow you." Alexander then left Marathus and occupied Byblos, which stood on a hill near the sea. It was said to be the oldest city in the world, and the birthplace of Adonis. Sidon welcomed him eagerly. He deposed its king, a Persian protege, and a romantic story is told of the choice of a new king by Hephaestion. According to the laws of Sidon, the sovereign must be of the royal house, and it appeared that a humble gardener in the district was of this blood, besides being of primitive virtue. The deputies of Hephaestion sought him out and found him weeding. They saluted him as king, bathed him, clothed him in purple, decked him with the royal insignia, and led him to the palace, where he managed to keep his simple nature unspoiled. Tyre alone and Phoenicia remained independent. Old Tyre lay on the mainland, Tyre proper on an adjacent island, the island of the Princess of the Sea, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty, described by the prophets Isaiah and Ezekiel. Shalmaneser had besieged it for 5 years, and Nebuchadnezzar had invested it for 13 years in vain, although the king of Tyre ultimately consented to pay tribute, and the city was now tributary to Persia. Alexander sent to inform its king that an oracle had bidden him sacrifice to Heracles, with whom Melkart, an old Phoenician deity, was identified, and the famous temple in their city. The Tyrians replied that they were willing to obey any other command of his, but would suffer neither Persian nor Macedonian to enter the city. The king wished to sacrifice. There was a more ancient temple of Heracles at Old Tyre. Alexander then knew that he must attack the island, even if it proved difficult as the labors of Heracles. Its capture would mean the possession of the celebrated Phoenician navy for war purposes, the absolute sovereignty of the sea, Macedonia and Greece safe behind him, and the easy conquest of Egypt. The siege of Tyre is the most interesting in the history of classical warfare, and illustrates the courage, inventiveness, patience, and good fortune which are so equally mixed in Alexander's life. He could not match the fleet of Tyre, rich in ships, and in order to conquer the city by land, set about to destroy its island condition, starting the construction of a mole 200 feet broad from the mainland to the island. The strait, about half a mile wide, was shallow near the mainland, but about 3 fathoms deep near the island, and the current at that point, where Alexander commenced the mole, bade him defiance. Abundant timber for the work was found on the mountains of Lebanon. Stone was obtained from Old Tyre, and these, heaped high as a mountain on the shore, were thrown down into the sea in alternate layers, stakes fixed in the mud of the channel holding the pier together. As long as the masons worked at a distance from the island, all went fairly well, but when they came into deeper water, and at the same time approached the city, they suffered severely under missiles from the walls. Then, too, the Tyrian triremes kept sailing up and attacking the workmen, clothed for work, not for war. 2 wooden towers were erected on the mole, and protected from the fire-bearing missiles of the enemy by specially prepared hides, which were also placed where they might screen the workers. From these towers missiles were hurled at the Tyrian ships. In reply, the Tyrians filled a vessel with dry fuel, chaff and torches, pitch and brimstone. They fixed 2 masts on the prow, and stretched on each a double-yard arm, from which they hung cauldrons of combustibles. Triremes towed the heavily laden vessel toward the mole and towers, and sailors threw fire from the vessel among the wood, at the same time running her aground as violently as possible, and dashing her against the end of the mole. If skill and heroism could have saved Tyre, she would not have been wiped off the face of the earth. As her crew swam away, a great flame caught Alexander's towers, and burned those within them to death. The triremes hovered near, and discharged showers of missiles on those who leaped down into the sea, or those who approached to extinguish the flames, while fresh detachments from the city sailed out and did as much damage as they could to the mole and to the engines of war. A storm aided the Tyrians in their work of destruction. Alexander had then to start his work afresh, and did so with dogged perseverance. The new mole was to have a wider base, contain more towers, and be in a direction better adjusted to the storms on this coast. How many years might have been consumed by the Macedonians in this way we cannot say, but a piece of great fortune now befell them. The sister city of Tyre, not content with giving her no aid, as they had submitted for the most part to Alexander, now sent him their ships, while the kings of Cyprus, an abode of the Hittites, whose history is so much interesting, the learned world today, sent him 120 vessels to Sidon. With these he could blockade Tyre. At the head of a magnificent fleet he sailed from Sidon, ready for his first naval battle. The Tyrians had been anxious to fight Alexander at sea, but drew back when they found, to their dismay, that he had obtained all the ships of Cyprus and Phoenicia. The city had two harbors, one, the Sidonian, on the north, looking towards Sidon, and the other, Egyptian, on the south, and those were now filled with Tyrian triremes in battle array. Alexander placed the Cyprian ships outside the Sidonian harbor, the Phoenician outside the Egyptian harbor, and himself took up his position near his mole. His artillery was turned on from the towers, and the Tyrians answered from towers constructed on their battlements to face the mole. The city walls were about 150 feet high and of great breadth, and it was not easy for ships or horses to convey battering engines near enough to make a breach, as large stones were cast down by the besieged. Alexander stationed ships to seize these stones and convey them by means of cranes into deep water, but Tyrian divers cut the cables and made anchoring impossible. Red-hot brass shields full of burning sand and boiling filth were thrown on their heads, but at last the besiegers got close enough to batter down the wall, and the besieged, in the last straits, determined to make a surprise sortie from the Sidonian harbor. In their despair they even thought of making human sacrifice to the gods. At about midday, when the Macedonian sailors were scattered in quest of necessaries, and Alexander usually retired to his tent, a few Tyrian vessels, with picked rowers and fighters, sailed out quietly in single file and attacked the Cyprian fleet. It happened, however, that Alexander on that particular day did not stay in his tent. He saw the Tyrian ships sail out, and hastily manned a few vessels, with which, before the rest were ready, he sailed right round the island to the rescue. The Tyrians sought to fly back into harbor, but the king forced them to an engagement and disabled most of their vessels. He then sailed round the city walls, testing every part, for he had not been able to shake the wall opposite the mole, and found a weak portion of the south side. A breach was made, and Alexander tried to throw a bridge over, but was beaten back. On the third day following, he made attacks on all sides to distract the enemy. Breaches were opened, bridges thrown on to the broken wall, and Alexander among the foremost to mount. The wall was scaled. Admetus, the first to ascend, was struck dead with a spear as he stood cheering, and the citizens disputed every inch of the way with the enemy. Advancing along the battlements, Alexander descended to the royal palace. Meanwhile, the Phoenician and Cyprian fleets had forced their respective ways into the two harbors, and captured the Tyrian fleet. The Tyrians for some time hurled stones from the roofs of their houses down on the Macedonians, and made a last stand at the fane of Agenor, father of Cadmus, the legendary founder of Tyre and Sidon, as of Grecian Thebes. 8,000 were slain, the rest, about 30,000, sold into slavery. Massacre commonly followed conquest in the East then as it does today, but Alexander was in so bloodthirsty a mood that his own soldiers were revolted. Thus fell Tyre after a 7-month siege, the end of July or beginning of August, 332 B.C. The coast regions of Palestine submitted, with the exception of Gaza, which the eunuch Battus had fortified and considered stronger than Tyre. It was the last city met with by the traveler going from Phoenicia to Egypt, at the parting of the desert and the Saône, and stood upon a lofty mound surrounded by a strong wall. Alexander, expert now in sieges, attacked the foundations of this town, built upon the sand, and caused a countermound to be constructed. On this the artillery used at Tyre was placed, and after a 2 months' siege, this city also fell. The inhabitants stood fighting for long after the Macedonian army had entered, as they knew from the fate of the Tyrians what alternative to death there was for them to choose, and nearly 10,000 were slain. Their women and children were then sold into slavery by the conqueror. These terrible examples made other cities chary of bidding Alexander defiance, and were therefore necessary to his conquests. but as Alexander's gigantic plans unfold, he seems to get farther and farther away from normal human nature. At Gaza he appears to have shown barbarous cruelty, perhaps partly on account of the 2 wounds he had received during the siege. Tyre rose again to greatness in Roman times, but Gaza, which Alexander used as a frontier fortress, was then still desolate. If, however, Alexander was to conquer the Persian Empire, and we do not know at this day the weight of his reasons for doing so, these deeds of cruelty were mercy, for numbers of cities that would have fought for Persia now peacefully submitted. Even his treatment of Battus, if true, may have been calculated. It depended on the satrap of Egypt as to whether that province should be organized to resist Alexander, or be delivered over to him without a blow being struck. When Mazdak heard of the barbarous treatment suffered by the commander at Gaza, he probably laid aside any ideas he had entertained of resistance. End of chapter 6.